Hey guys, settle in. Tonight, we're talking about forks. Not modern forks, medieval forks. An invention so unnecessary, so suspicious, and so deeply disliked that for centuries people genuinely believed it was morally questionable. Because medieval people trusted hands. God gave you fingers, flexible, reliable, always attached. Why would you replace them with metal fingers? Early forks were rare, awkward objects with too long prongs and no social support. They didn't scoop well. They didn't stab reliably. They existed in a strange middle space where spoons and knives both looked at them and asked, "What exactly are you doing here?" People didn't just ignore forks. They mocked them. Using a fork was considered pretentious, foreign, excessive, something rich people did when they wanted to look impressive while eating slightly less efficiently. Some religious leaders went further. They argued forks were sinful, an insult to God's design. If food was meant to be eaten with utensils, they reasoned, God would have given humans metal prongs instead of hands. Which is a bold theological stance to take against pasta. Forks also failed practically. They were hard to use. Food slipped off. They required practice, which was already suspicious. And worst of all, they made you look ridiculous while failing. So most people stuck with hands, knives, and spoons. Simple tools. Tools that worked. By any reasonable standard, forks failed. And yet, they survived. Not because they were better, but because they represented something medieval society couldn't resist. Status. Forks signaled refinement. Distance from labor. The luxury of eating slowly without needing to tear food apart like someone with responsibilities. So people tolerated them, judged them, and eventually copied them. And that's where part 1 ends. Because next time, we'll talk about how forks spread, why people still complained, and how an object once considered sinful became mandatory. For now, remember this. When you twirl pasta around a fork, you're not being efficient. You're participating in a medieval argument that never really ended. Medieval Forks, Part 2, the utensil nobody asked for. Welcome back. Last time, we met the fork at its lowest point. Mocked, distrusted, accused of moral corruption for daring to exist near a plate of food. Tonight, we answer the obvious question. If forks were so unpopular, why didn't they disappear? The fork's biggest advantage. Forks did not survive because they were useful. They survived because they were exclusive. For centuries, forks were mostly seen in wealthy households, royal courts, and foreign banquets. Especially in Byzantium and parts of Italy. And this immediately made them suspicious. Because in medieval Europe, anything foreign was either 1. Dangerous, 2. Pretentious, 3. Witchcraft, 4. All three. Forks were associated with luxury, leisure, and not needing to rush your meals because you had servants and time. They were less about eating, and more about signaling that you were important enough to eat slowly. And people noticed. Public backlash. When forks appeared at public feasts or noble gatherings, reactions were rarely positive. Chroniclers mocked them. Guests whispered. Some openly refused to use them. One famous account describes nobles watching a woman eat with a fork, only for her to later fall ill. Naturally, the conclusion was obvious. The fork had offended God. Not illness, not hygiene, the fork. This logic made perfect sense at the time. Why would you need a fork unless you were trying to avoid touching food like a normal, humble person? The hygiene problem nobody wanted to admit. Here's the irony. Forks were actually cleaner. Hands carried dirt, bacteria, and whatever you'd been doing earlier, which, in medieval life, could include animals, soil, tools, or other people. But hygiene was not the selling point. Because admitting forks were cleaner meant admitting hands were filthy. And that was an uncomfortable realization medieval society was not ready to have. So instead, forks were criticized for being effeminate, unnecessary, arrogant, overcomplicated. Which is historically what people say when they don't want change. Slow, reluctant acceptance. Forks spread quietly, not through practicality, through imitation. Nobles copied other nobles. Courts copied courts. What the rich did eventually became fashionable. And once fashion gets involved, logic becomes optional. By the late Middle Ages, forks began appearing more often, but still inconsistently. Some meals used them, some didn't. Some people owned forks but didn't know when to use them. It was awkward, it was confusing, and it annoyed everyone, which means the fork was doing great. Why the fork truly won? Forks solved just enough of a problem to survive. They kept hands cleaner, they worked better with certain foods. And most importantly, they became expected. Once people adjusted, going back felt wrong. Touching food felt primitive, messy, uncivilized. The fork didn't replace hands because it was superior. It replaced them because culture decided it should. And that is the fork's real legacy. Where this leaves us. Today, we refuse to eat pasta without forks. We feel uncomfortable touching food directly. We judge people who do. Which is impressive, considering this utensil was once considered sinful, unnecessary, and deeply annoying. So when you pick up a fork, remember, you're not using a perfect tool. You're honoring a medieval status symbol that bullied its way into permanence. Medieval Forks, Part 3, the utensil nobody asked for. Alright, final round. We've seen the fork arrive uninvited. We've watched it get mocked, moralized against, and reluctantly tolerated. Tonight, we answer the last question. Why, after all of that, do we still use it? The fork never became perfect. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Forks never actually solved eating. They helped, sometimes, with certain foods, under specific conditions, but they didn't replace hands because they were better. They replaced hands because they were acceptable. Forks stab. They don't scoop. They struggle with rice. They fail completely at soup. They require a spoon to finish the job, and a knife to prepare it. The fork did not simplify eating. It added management, and yet, we kept it. The illusion of civilization. By the early modern period, forks were no longer optional. They were symbols. Eating with your hands became associated with poverty, foreignness, bad manners, not because it stopped working, but because society decided it looked wrong. The fork became etiquette, and etiquette is one of the strongest forces in human history. Once forks were taught at the table, enforced in households, and expected in public, the argument was over. You didn't use a fork because it was efficient. You used it because not using one said something about you. The fork's quiet victory. Here's the genius of the fork. It didn't need to be loved. It just needed to be normal. Generations grew up with forks in their hands. They never questioned them. They never noticed the inefficiency. By the time someone realized spoons do more work, it was too late. Culture had locked it in. The fork won by being inherited. Modern annoyances, medieval roots. Even today, forks slip. Food falls. Tines bend. Plates scrape. We complain. We adjust. We keep using them anyway. Because at this point, the fork isn't a tool. It's a rule. Try eating spaghetti with your hands in public and see how quickly history shows up to correct you. The final irony. Medieval people thought forks were unnatural. Now, we think hands are. And that's the real legacy. Not innovation, not improvement, normalization. So when you pick up a fork tonight, remember, you're holding an object that failed at first, annoyed everyone, was accused of being sinful, never became perfect, and still won, not because it worked best, but because once something survives long enough, we stop imagining alternatives, and that's where medieval history lives best. Right there on your plate. Medieval Forks, Part 4, the utensil nobody asked for. Alright, last chapter didn't end with triumph. It ended with acceptance. So now we jump forward. Not to the Renaissance, not to the Industrial Revolution, but to us. Because if the fork really won, it should be flawless by now. It isn't. The fork in the modern world. In theory, the fork is a solved problem. Centuries of refinement, better metals, better shapes, better balance. And yet, it still drops food. It still fails at rice. It still needs a spoon to finish anything liquid, and a knife to prepare anything solid. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If we were designing eating tools today, from scratch, with no tradition involved, would we invent the fork? Probably not. We'd invent something that scoops and grips. Something efficient. Something practical. But we didn't. Because we already had a fork. Why the fork is untouchable. By the time modern design thinking existed, the fork was no longer a utensil. It was etiquette. Restaurants expect it. Schools teach it. Formal dinners enforce it. The fork isn't protected by usefulness. It's protected by social pressure. You can improve it slightly. Change the metal. Adjust the weight. But you cannot replace it. Without being labeled difficult, childish, or uncivilized. That's not engineering. That's tradition with consequences. Cultural inconsistency. Here's the quiet irony. Large parts of the world never fully adopted forks. They use hands, chopsticks, bread, spoons, and they eat just fine. Sometimes faster, sometimes cleaner, sometimes with fewer dropped noodles. But in fork-centered cultures, those methods are often treated as alternatives, instead of perfectly valid solutions. Not because they're worse, but because they're unfamiliar. The fork didn't become universal because it was superior. It became dominant because it was inherited by the cultures that later wrote the rules. The fork's real achievement. The fork's greatest success wasn't improving eating. It was surviving long enough to feel inevitable. At no point did humanity vote on it. At no point did we redesign the system. We just kept going. Parents taught children. Children taught their children. And eventually, questioning the fork felt strange. That's how medieval inventions truly win. Not by being right, but by being old. So where does that leave us? The fork is still here. Still slightly inconvenient. Still incomplete. A medieval solution. Living comfortably in a modern world that pretends it was always this way. So the next time you struggle with pasta, or chase a pea around your plate, or need 3 tools to finish one meal, remember, Medieval Forks, Part 6, the utensil nobody asked for. At this point, the fork has done something remarkable. It has stopped being questioned, which is always the final stage of a successful failure. When an object becomes invisible, you don't think about forks. You notice when one is missing. You notice when it's bent. You notice when it's the wrong size. But you never ask why it exists. That's how you know it won. The fork has crossed the line from tool to assumption. And assumptions are dangerous, because they don't need to make sense anymore. The fork versus the food. Here's something quietly absurd. Modern food has evolved. Pasta shapes optimized for sauce. Rice engineered to be fluffier. Meat cut thinner. Vegetables processed, sliced, standardized. The fork has not. Same prongs. Same limitations. Same silent struggle. We didn't redesign the fork to match food. We redesigned food to tolerate the fork. That is not innovation. That is surrender. Why no one fixes it? Every few years, someone tries. Sporks. Hybrid utensils. Ergonomic designs. They appear. They promise efficiency. They disappear quietly. Not because they fail mechanically, but because they fail socially. They look wrong. And looking wrong is unforgivable. The fork doesn't survive because it's optimal. It survives because it's familiar. The fork is social test. Watch people eat. The fork isn't about nourishment anymore. It's about signaling control. Children are taught to hold it correctly. Adults are judged for how they use it. Formal dinners turn it into choreography. Wrong fork. Wrong order. Wrong angle. You didn't fail at eating. You failed at knowing the rules. Rules no one remembers learning. The medieval pattern repeats. This is where the fork becomes unmistakably medieval again. Because medieval products didn't survive by being good. They survived by becoming unavoidable. Once something is baked into daily life, changing it feels disruptive, childish, or rude. Even if it's worse. Especially if it's worse. The quiet ending. So here we are, in a modern world of satellites and supercomputers, still poking food with medieval metal fingers. Because questioning them feels strange. The fork didn't improve eating. It improved conformity. And that's why it lasted. Not because it was the best answer, but because it was the first one people stopped arguing about. So when you pick up a fork tonight, and it does its job, poorly but acceptably, remember, that's not progress.